The morning fog rolled thick across London streets as Margaret Thornfield walked slowly toward the massive iron gates of Buckingham Palace. Her worn leather medical bag felt heavier with each step, not because of the instruments inside, but because of the weight of what she was about to attempt. She stopped just outside the gates, watching the guards in their bright red uniforms, standing perfectly still. Their faces showed no emotion, but their eyes followed her every movement. Margaret had seen those same cold stares countless times before. It was the look people gave her when they discovered she was a doctor. A woman doctor in 1867. Such a thing was almost unthinkable. The guard captain stepped forward, his medals catching the weak sunlight. "State your business, miss," he said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who already knew the answer would be unacceptable. Margaret lifted her chin higher. "I am Dr. Margaret Thornfield. I have come to offer my medical services to the royal family." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Then, slowly, the captain began to laugh. Not a cruel laugh, but the kind of laugh someone makes when they hear something so impossible that it becomes funny. The other guards joined in, their laughter echoing off the palace walls. "Listen carefully, miss," the captain said, wiping his eyes. "No commoner has ever touched royal blood. No woman has ever treated a member of the royal family, and certainly no woman from the common folk will ever be allowed near their sacred persons. It simply is not done. It cannot be done. It will never be done." Margaret felt her heart sink, but she refused to let it show on her face. This was not the first time someone had told her something was impossible. In fact, her entire life had been built on doing things people said could not be done. She thought back to her childhood in the small village of Millbrook, where her father worked as a blacksmith. The sound of his hammer hitting hot metal had been the soundtrack of her early years. Their house was tiny, with just 2 rooms, and money was always tight. But her father had something most men of his station did not have. He could read. Every evening after work, covered in soot and sweat, he would sit by the fireplace and read aloud from whatever books he could find. Medical texts, philosophy, history, anything that expanded their understanding of the world beyond their small village. Margaret absorbed every word like a sponge. When she was 12, a traveling doctor came through their village. An outbreak of fever had struck, and people were dying. Margaret watched in fascination as the doctor worked, cleaning wounds, preparing medicines, saving lives. That night she told her father she wanted to become a doctor. Her father was quiet. For a long time, then he said, "Child, women cannot become doctors. It is not allowed. The medical schools will not accept you. The hospitals will not employ you. Society will not accept you." But something in Margaret's eyes must have convinced him, because the next morning he began teaching her everything he knew about the human body from his medical books. For 5 years, she learned in secret, studying by candlelight after her daily chores were done. At 17, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She cut her long hair short, bound her chest with cloth, and dressed in men's clothing. She had practiced deepening her voice and changing her walk. She chose a new name, Michael Thompson, and set off for London to apply to medical school. The deception was not easy. Every day brought new challenges. She had to be careful about everything: how she walked, how she spoke, how she interacted with other students. She lived in constant fear of discovery, knowing that if anyone found out, she would be expelled immediately and probably arrested. But Margaret was brilliant. She scored higher than most of her classmates on examinations. She showed remarkable skill in treating patients. Her professors praised Michael Thompson as one of the most promising medical students they had ever seen. For 4 years, she maintained the disguise. She graduated at the top of her class and began working as a doctor in London's poorest neighborhoods. The sick and injured did not care that their doctor was secretly a woman. They only cared that she could ease their pain and save their lives. It was during her 5th year of practice that everything changed. She was treating a young woman who had been injured in a factory accident when someone recognized her. Word spread quickly through the medical community. The truth came out. The scandal was enormous. Newspapers wrote shocking stories about the female fraud who had tricked her way into the medical profession. The medical establishment was furious. They tried to strip her of her degree, to ban her from practicing medicine. But something unexpected happened. The people in the poor neighborhoods where she worked rose up to defend her. They had seen her work. They knew she was a skilled doctor. They did not care that she was a woman. They cared that she had saved their children, their parents, their neighbors. A group of progressive politicians and wealthy supporters rallied around her cause. They argued that her deception, while wrong, had proven an important point: that women could be just as skilled as men in medicine. After months of legal battles and public debate, Margaret was allowed to continue practicing, becoming one of the first officially recognized female doctors in England. But even with this victory, barriers remained. The wealthy still would not accept treatment from a woman. The medical establishment barely tolerated her presence. And the royal family, they might as well have lived on another planet for all the chance she had of treating them. Now standing outside the palace gates, Margaret remembered all the times she had been told no. All the times people had said something was impossible, all the times she had proven them wrong. The guard captain was still smiling, waiting for her to turn around and leave. But Margaret did not move. She stood straighter, her voice calm and steady. I understand your position, Captain, but I will not be leaving just yet. I believe there may come a day when my skills will be needed here. When that day comes, I will be ready. The captain's smile faded slightly. There was something in this woman's voice, something in her eyes, that made him take her more seriously. Miss, I appreciate your dedication, but what you are suggesting is truly impossible. The royal physicians are the finest in the land. They have trained at the best schools, studied under the greatest masters. They are men of noble birth who understand the sacred nature of royal blood. No outsider, particularly no woman, could ever possess the knowledge or the right to treat royalty. Margaret nodded slowly. Perhaps you are right, Captain. Perhaps it is impossible. But I have made a career of doing impossible things. Good day to you. She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. Behind her, the guards watched until she disappeared into the London fog. They had no way of knowing that this would not be the last time they would see Dr. Margaret Thornfield. As she walked through the winding streets back to her clinic in the poor section of London. Margaret's mind was already working. She knew that direct approaches would never work. The barriers were too strong, too deeply rooted in tradition and prejudice. But she also knew that life had a way of creating opportunities where none had existed before. In her clinic, she continued her work with the same dedication she had always shown. But now she had a new goal, a new dream that seemed impossible to everyone else. She would find a way to prove that skill and compassion mattered more than birth or gender. She would show them that healing knew no boundaries. She had no idea that her opportunity would come sooner than she thought, or that it would arrive in the form of a crisis that would shake the very foundations of the monarchy itself. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret's visit to the palace gates. The autumn rain drummed steadily against the windows of her small clinic in Whitechapel, where she spent her days treating workers, street children, and anyone else who could not afford the expensive doctors in the wealthy parts of London. The clinic was nothing fancy, just 3 rooms in a building that had seen better days. The walls were stained with age, and the floorboards creaked with every step, but it was clean, and more importantly, it was a place where people could get help regardless of how much money they had in their pockets. Margaret was examining a young boy with a persistent cough when her assistant, Mrs. Helen Bradford, burst through the door. Helen was a widow who had started helping Margaret after her own daughter had been saved by the doctor's quick thinking during a difficult birth. "Doctor, you need to see this," Helen said, her voice trembling with excitement. She held up a newspaper, her hands shaking slightly. "Look at the headline." Margaret took the paper and felt her heart skip a beat. The headline read, "Royal Family in Crisis, Prince Falls Gravely Ill." The story was brief but alarming. Prince Albert Victor, the young grandson of Queen Victoria, had suddenly fallen sick with a mysterious illness. The royal physicians were baffled. Traditional treatments were not working, and the prince's condition was getting worse by the day. Margaret read the article twice, her medical mind already analyzing the few symptoms mentioned. Fever, weakness, strange spots on the skin. She had seen these signs before, many times, in the crowded tenements where she worked. "Helen," she said slowly, "prepare the treatment room. I have a feeling we're going to be very busy today." Sure enough, within hours, people began arriving at the clinic with similar symptoms. First it was Mrs. Thompson from the bakery down the street. Then came the Carter family, all 4 children showing the same signs. By evening, Margaret had treated 12 patients with identical symptoms. But here was the difference. While the royal physicians were puzzled, Margaret knew exactly what she was dealing with. She had encountered this illness dozens of times in the past year. It was a new type of fever that spread quickly in crowded, dirty conditions. The key was not just treating the fever, but cleaning everything the patient had touched and keeping them away from others until they recovered. Margaret worked through the night, moving from bed to bed in the small rooms above her clinic where she kept the sickest patients. She washed her hands between each patient, something most doctors thought was unnecessary. She boiled all the instruments she used. She kept the rooms as clean as possible and made sure fresh air could flow through the windows. By morning, her patients were already showing improvement. The fever was breaking, the spots were fading, and they were able to eat small amounts of food. Margaret knew that within a week, they would be completely recovered. As she sat drinking tea and reviewing her notes, Margaret could not help but think about the prince. The same illness that she was treating successfully in her humble clinic was defeating the finest doctors in the kingdom. The irony was not lost on her. She had the knowledge they needed, but the barriers of class and gender made it impossible for her to help. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. A well-dressed woman arrived at the clinic, looking very out of place among the usual patients. She wore expensive clothes and spoke with the refined accent of the upper class, but there was something about her manner that suggested she was trying to blend in, to not draw attention to herself. "I am looking for Dr. Margaret Thornfield," the woman said quietly. Margaret studied her carefully. "I am Dr. Thornfield. How may I help you?" The woman glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "My name is Lady Catherine Wessex. I serve in the royal household. I've come to speak with you about a matter of great importance." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. She led Lady Catherine to her private office, a small room at the back of the clinic where she kept her medical books and wrote her patient notes. Lady Catherine looked around the modest room, taking in the simple furniture and worn medical texts. "Doctor, I will be direct. The prince is dying. The royal physicians have tried everything they know, but nothing is working. His condition grows worse each day." Margaret nodded but said nothing. She had learned that sometimes the best response was to listen. "I have been making inquiries," Lady Catherine continued. "I have heard remarkable stories about your work here in Whitechapel. They say you have been treating an illness with symptoms very similar to what the prince is experiencing. They say your patients recover completely." "That is true," Margaret said carefully, "but I fail to see how this information helps the prince. As I was told quite clearly at the palace gates, no commoner, especially no woman, will ever be allowed to treat royalty." Lady Catherine's face showed her internal struggle. "Doctor, I have served the royal family for 15 years. I have never questioned the traditions, the protocols, the way things have always been done. But I cannot stand by and watch a young man die when there might be someone who could save him." Margaret leaned forward. "Lady Catherine, what exactly are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting that sometimes, in desperate circumstances, rules must be bent. The prince's regular physicians leave the palace each evening at sunset. The night staff consists mainly of nurses and servants. If someone with the right knowledge were to visit during those hours, they might be able to help without anyone asking too many questions." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "Are asking me to enter the palace illegally, to treat the prince without permission. If we were discovered, the consequences would be severe for both of us." Lady Catherine nodded grimly. "I am aware of the risks, but I am also aware that doing nothing guarantees the prince will die. Are you willing to consider it?" Margaret stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the busy street below. Everything she had worked for, everything she had built, could be destroyed in a single night. But she also knew that if she could save the prince, it would prove, once and for all, that skill mattered more than birth or gender. "Tell me more about his condition," she said finally. Lady Catherine's eyes lit up with hope. "The fever comes and goes. He has developed a rash across his chest and arms. He cannot keep food down, and he grows weaker each day. The physicians have tried bleeding him, giving him various tonics, but nothing helps." Margaret nodded. It was exactly what she had suspected. "Lady Catherine, I believe I can help the prince, but I need to know exactly what we would be facing. How would I get into the palace? How long would I have? What happens if we are discovered?" For the next hour they discussed every detail. Lady Catherine knew the palace like the back of her hand. She knew which guards worked, which shifts, which passages were watched, and which were not. How to move through the building without being seen. As the sun began to set, Lady Catherine stood. "To leave. Doctor, I need your answer. Will you help us?" Margaret looked at her medical bag, then at the certificates on her wall, proving her qualifications. She thought about all the times she had been told something was impossible. She thought about the young prince lying sick in the palace while she had the knowledge to save him. "Yes," she said quietly, "I will help. But we do this my way, with my methods. And if we succeed, I want it known that a woman doctor saved the prince's life." Lady Catherine smiled for the first time since arriving. "Doctor, if you can save him, I will personally make sure the whole world knows who you are and what you accomplished." As Lady Catherine left the clinic, Margaret began preparing for the most dangerous night of her life. She had no idea that Within 24 hours, she would be standing beside the bed of a future king, about to change the course of history forever. The clock struck midnight as Margaret waited in the shadows outside the palace's east gate. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain the guards could hear it. She had spent the entire day preparing, checking and rechecking her medical supplies, going over Lady Catherine's detailed instructions again and again. Her medical bag contained everything she thought she might need: clean bandages, antiseptic solutions she had prepared herself, fever-reducing medicines, and most importantly, a special mixture that had proven effective against the mysterious illness affecting the prince. She had also brought soap, something most doctors considered unnecessary but which Margaret knew could mean the difference between life and death. A soft whistle came from the darkness. Lady Catherine emerged from behind a large oak tree, dressed in dark clothes instead of her usual elegant gowns. Even in the moonlight, Margaret could see the worry etched on her face. "Doctor, are you ready?" Lady Catherine whispered. Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. She had done many dangerous things in her life, but nothing compared to this. If they were caught, she would likely spend years in prison. Lady Catherine would lose her position and probably face even worse consequences. Lady Catherine led her along a narrow path that ran beside the palace wall. They moved carefully, stopping every few steps to listen for guards. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they reached a small wooden door hidden behind overgrown ivy. "This is the old servants' entrance," Lady Catherine explained, as she produced a key from her pocket. "It has not been used in years, but I still have access. Once we are inside, we must move quickly and quietly." The door opened with a soft creak. Inside, Margaret found herself in a narrow hallway lit by a single oil lamp. The walls were plain stone, nothing like the grand rooms she had imagined filled the palace. This was clearly a part of the building where only servants were meant to go. They climbed a winding staircase, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets. Lady Catherine knew exactly where to go, turning left and right through a maze of corridors. Margaret tried to remember the route in case they needed to escape quickly, but the palace was far more complex than she had expected. Finally, they stopped outside a heavy wooden door. Lady Catherine put her finger to her lips and slowly turned the handle. The door opened to reveal a magnificent bedroom, far larger than Margaret's entire clinic. Heavy curtains blocked most of the moonlight, but she could make out expensive furniture and paintings on the walls. In the center of the room stood a massive four-poster bed, and in that bed lay a young man who could barely lift his head. Prince Albert Victor was just 19 years old, but the illness had aged him terribly. His face was pale and drawn, covered with the same spotted rash Margaret had seen on her patients in Whitechapel. "Your Highness," Lady Catherine whispered, "I have brought someone who might be able to help you." The prince's eyes flickered open. They were bright with fever, but Margaret could see intelligence there, and desperation. "Who, double quotes," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I am Dr. Margaret Thornfield, Your Highness," she said quietly, moving closer to the bed. "I have treated others with your condition. With your permission, I would like to examine you." The prince nodded weakly. Margaret had expected him to be shocked that a woman doctor was treating him, but he seemed beyond caring about such things. He just wanted to feel better. Margaret set down her medical bag and began her examination. She had learned to work quickly and efficiently, and even in the dim light, she could see everything she needed to see. The prince's symptoms were exactly what she had expected: the fever, the rash, the weakness. But there was something else, something the royal physicians had probably missed. "Lady Catherine," she said quietly, "I need more light, and I need hot water. Can you arrange this without raising suspicion?" Lady Catherine nodded and disappeared from the room. Margaret continued her examination, feeling the prince's pulse, checking his breathing, looking carefully at the rash pattern. When Lady Catherine returned with a basin of hot water and additional oil lamps, Margaret was ready to begin treatment. "Your Highness," she said gently, "I believe your illness is caused by an infection that spreads through dirty conditions. The first thing we must do is clean everything around you, your bedding, your clothing, even your room. Then I will give you medicine that will help your body fight the infection." The prince nodded again, too weak to speak. Margaret began by washing her hands thoroughly, then cleaning the prince's skin with the antiseptic solution she had brought. She changed his bedding, replacing it with clean sheets Lady Catherine had quietly obtained from the linen closet. As she worked, Margaret explained to Lady Catherine what she was doing and why. "Most doctors do not understand that cleanliness can prevent illness," she said. "They think disease comes from bad air or evil spirits. but I have learned that many illnesses are caused by tiny creatures, too small to see, and these creatures can be killed by proper cleaning. Lady Catherine watched in fascination as Margaret worked. This was completely different from anything she had seen the royal physicians do. They usually stood back from patients, prescribing medicines from a distance. Margaret was hands-on, thorough, and most importantly, she seemed to know exactly what she was doing. Next, Margaret prepared the special medicine she had brought. It was a mixture of herbs and compounds that had proven effective against the fever. She helped the prince drink it slowly, making sure he did not choke. The medicine will help reduce your fever and fight the infection, she explained. But you must also drink as much water as possible. Your body needs fluids to heal itself. For the next several hours, Margaret worked steadily. She cleaned and disinfected everything in the room. She prepared cooling cloths for the prince's forehead. She monitored his breathing and pulse. Most importantly, she stayed calm and confident, something that seemed to comfort the young prince. As dawn approached, something remarkable happened. The prince's fever began to break. The constant sweating stopped, and his skin began to feel cooler. His breathing became easier, and he was able to drink water without difficulty. Doctor, he whispered, I feel ... better. The pain is less. Margaret smiled, feeling a tremendous weight lift from her shoulders. The worst is over, Your Highness. You will need to rest for several more days, but you are going to recover completely. Lady Catherine had been watching from across the room, barely daring to breathe. Now she approached the bed, tears in her eyes. Doctor, you have performed a miracle. Margaret shook her head. Not a miracle, Lady Catherine, just proper medical care. This young man was never going to die from this illness, but he needed treatment based on understanding, not tradition. The prince struggled to sit up slightly. Dr. Thornfield, I do not know how to thank you. You have saved my life, Your Highness. Just knowing you will recover is thanks enough, Margaret replied. But I must ask something of you. When you are well again, please remember that healing has nothing to do with the doctor's birth or gender. It only has to do with knowledge and skill. The prince nodded seriously. I will remember, Doctor, I give you my word. As the sun rose fully, Margaret knew their time was running out. The royal physicians would return soon, and questions would be asked about the prince's sudden improvement. Lady Catherine led her back through the maze of corridors to the servants' entrance. Doctor, Lady Catherine said as they reached the door, what happens now? The prince is better, but how do we explain it? Margaret had been thinking about this problem all night. We do not try to explain it yet, she said. Let the royal physicians take credit for the improvement. But when the time is right, when the prince is completely well, the truth will come out. And when it does, everything will change. As Margaret walked back through the empty London streets toward her clinic, she felt something she had never experienced before. For the first time in her life, she had been able to use her skills without any barriers, without anyone questioning her right to heal. The prince had not cared that she was a woman or a commoner. He had only cared that she could help him. She knew that the consequences of this night were just beginning. Soon, people would start asking questions about the prince's miraculous recovery. The royal physicians would be confused and possibly suspicious. The truth would eventually surface, and when it did, Margaret would have to face the most difficult challenge of her life. But for now, she was content knowing that she had proven something important, that skill and compassion were more powerful than tradition and prejudice. The young prince would live, and somewhere in the palace, the seeds of change had been planted. 2 weeks had passed since that fateful night in the palace. Margaret had returned to her normal routine, treating patients in her clinic and trying to act as though nothing had changed. But something had changed, and she could feel it in the air around her. The newspapers were full of stories about the prince's miraculous recovery. The royal physicians were being praised as heroes, taking credit for using advanced new treatments that had saved the young man's life. Margaret read these articles with a mixture of amusement and frustration, knowing the truth but unable to speak it. Prince Albert Victor had made a complete recovery, just as Margaret had predicted. According to the papers, he was back to his normal activities, looking healthier than he had in months. But Margaret knew that questions were starting to be asked behind the palace walls. Dr. Harrison Pemberton, the chief royal physician, was a proud man who had spent 30 years building his reputation. He was considered one of the finest doctors in England, trained at the most prestigious medical schools and trusted by the royal family for decades. But the prince's sudden recovery had left him confused and suspicious. Margaret was treating a young mother with a difficult pregnancy when Helen burst into the clinic, her face pale with worry. Doctor, there are men here to see you, official-looking men. They say they are from the Royal College of Physicians. Margaret's heart sank. She had known this day would come, but she had hoped for more time. Send them in, Helen, and please, stay close, I may need your help. 3 men entered her small office, all wearing expensive suits and stern expressions. The leader was Dr. Pemberton himself, a tall man with grey hair and cold blue eyes. Behind him stood 2 other physicians. Margaret recognized from medical conferences, both members of the Royal College. Dr. Thornfield, Dr. Pemberton said, his voice dripping with disdain. We need to have a conversation about your recent activities. Margaret gestured to the chairs in front of her desk. Please, sit down. How can I help you? Dr. Pemberton remained, standing, clearly intending to intimidate her. We have conducted an investigation into the prince's recent illness and recovery. Some very disturbing information has come to light. Margaret kept her expression neutral. I am glad to hear the prince has recovered. That is wonderful news. Do not play games with us, Dr. Pemberton snapped. We know you were in the palace that night. We know you treated the prince without authorization. We know you interfered with the care of a member of the royal family. Margaret felt her mouth go dry, but she forced herself to remain calm. I am not sure what you are suggesting. Dr. Pemberton, I work here in Whitechapel, treating the poor and working class. I have never been invited to treat anyone in the royal family. One of the other physicians stepped forward. We have witnesses, Dr. Thornfield, servants who saw you in the palace corridors. We have examined the prince's room and found evidence of your unconventional methods. Margaret's mind raced. She had been careful to remove all traces of her presence, but apparently not careful enough. Gentlemen, I think there has been some misunderstanding. Dr. Pemberton slammed his hand on her desk. There is no misunderstanding. You, a woman of common birth, dared to lay hands on royal blood. You practiced medicine on the future king without permission, without training, without any right to do so. Without training. Margaret stood up, her anger finally overcoming her caution. I graduated at the top of my medical school class. I have been practicing medicine for over 10 years. I have saved more lives in this clinic than most doctors see in their entire careers. Do not speak to me about training. You obtained your medical degree through fraud and deception. Dr. Pemberton shouted. You have no right to practice medicine at all, let alone on members of the royal family. Margaret felt something snap inside her. She had spent her entire life being told she was not good enough, not qualified enough, not qualified enough. But she had proven herself over and over again. She had saved the prince's life when these supposedly great physicians had failed. Dr. Pemberton, she said quietly, the prince was dying. Your treatments were not working. If I had not intervened, he would be dead right now. Are you angry because I saved his life, or because I proved that your methods were wrong? The room fell silent. Dr. Pemberton's face turned red with rage. You will come with us now. You will face a formal tribunal of the Royal College of Physicians. You will answer for your crimes. Margaret knew she had no choice. If she refused, they would simply have her arrested. At least at a tribunal, she would have a chance to defend herself very well. But I wanted on record that I saved that young man's life, and I would do it again. The tribunal took place 3 days later in the Grand Hall of the Royal College of Physicians. Word had spread quickly through London's medical community, and the hall was packed with doctors, medical students, and curious observers. Several newspaper reporters had also managed to gain entry. Margaret sat alone at a small table facing a panel of 12 of the most senior physicians in England. Dr. Pemberton served as the chief prosecutor, presenting the case against her, had been allowed to bring her medical books and notes, but she had no lawyer and no supporters among the medical establishment. Dr. Pemberton stood before the panel, his voice booming through the hall. Gentlemen, we are here today to address one of the most serious violations of medical ethics in our history. This woman, he pointed dramatically at Margaret, illegally entered the royal palace and treated a member of the royal family without authorization. He went on to describe her deception in obtaining her medical degree, her inappropriate methods of treatment, and her complete disregard for the traditions and protocols of royal medical care. The panel listened solemnly, occasionally nodding in agreement. When Dr. Pemberton finished, the chief judge looked at Margaret. Dr. Thornfield, you may now present your defense. Margaret stood slowly, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. She had spent the previous 3 days preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, she felt strangely calm. Gentlemen, she began, her voice clear and strong, I stand before you accused of saving a young man's life. If that is a crime, then I am guilty. A murmur ran through the hall. This was not the apologetic response they had expected. Margaret continued, "You have heard Dr. Pemberton describe my methods as inappropriate. Let me tell you about these methods. I cleaned the patient's wounds with antiseptic solutions. I changed his bedding to prevent reinfection. I gave him medicine based on my understanding of how diseases spread and how the body heals. These are not radical ideas, they are based on careful observation and scientific study." She opened one of her medical books and began to read from her notes. "In the past year, I have treated 47 patients with symptoms identical to those of the prince. 46 of them recovered completely using my methods. The one who did not recover had waited too long to seek treatment." Margaret looked directly at Dr. Pemberton. "Dr. Pemberton, how many patients with these symptoms have you treated successfully?" Dr. Pemberton's face reddened. "That is not relevant to this tribunal." "I think it is very relevant," Margaret replied. "The prince was dying under your care. He recovered under mine. The question is not whether I had the right to treat him, but whether I had the right to let him die when I knew I could save him." The hall erupted in discussion. Some people seemed shocked by her boldness, while others appeared to be considering her words. Margaret pressed on. "You speak of royal blood as though it is different from common blood. But when the prince was burning with fever, when he was struggling to breathe, when he was in pain, was his suffering any different from that of the factory worker or the street child? Does pain recognize class distinctions? Does disease care about noble birth?" Margaret's voice grew stronger as she continued. "I have spent my life studying the human body, learning how it works, how it heals, how it can be helped when it is sick. I have never once found any evidence that royal blood is different from common blood. We are all human beings, and we all deserve the best medical care available." She turned to address the packed hall. "Some of you may think I am presumptuous, that I overstepped my bounds. But I ask you to consider this. If your child was dying, and someone had the knowledge to save them, would you care whether that person was a man or a woman? Would you care whether they were rich or poor? Or would you care only that they could help your child live?" The silence in the hall was complete. Margaret could see that her words were having an effect, that people were beginning to question the assumptions they had held their entire lives. "I do not apologize for saving the prince's life," she concluded. "I do not apologize for using methods that work instead of methods that are traditional. And I do not apologize for being a woman who dared to practice medicine. If these things make me guilty, then I accept that guilt gladly." Margaret sat down to scattered applause from the audience. The panel of judges looked uncertain, clearly not expecting such a passionate and reasoned defense. Dr. Pemberton jumped to his feet, preparing to offer a rebuttal, but before he could speak, the doors of the hall opened. A hush fell over the crowd as a figure in an elegant dress entered the hall. Lady Catherine Wessex walked slowly down the center aisle, her head held high. Behind her, supported by two. The great hall of the Royal College of Physicians had never seen anything like this. Prince Albert Victor stood before the tribunal panel, his presence commanding complete silence from the hundreds of people packed into the room. Even Dr. Pemberton seemed frozen in place, unsure how to respond to this unexpected turn of events. "Your Highness," the Chief Judge stammered, rising from his seat, "we did not expect, that is, we were not informed, ... double quotes. The prince raised his hand gently. "Please, remain seated. I have come here of my own accord because I believe the truth must be told about what happened during my illness." Margaret felt her heart racing. She had no idea what the prince was going to say, but his presence changed everything. This was no longer just a medical tribunal, it had become a matter of royal testimony. Prince Albert Victor turned to face the audience, his voice clear and strong. 3 weeks ago, I was dying. The finest physicians in England, men I trusted and respected, had tried everything they knew to save me. But I was getting worse each day. I could feel my strength leaving me, and I began to prepare for death. A murmur ran through the hall. It was extraordinary for a member of the royal family to speak so openly about personal matters, especially illness. Then, one night, a woman came to my room. She was unlike any doctor I had ever met. She did not stand back and make pronouncements from a distance. She rolled up her sleeves and went to work. She cleaned my room, changed my bedding, washed my wounds. She treated me not as a prince, but as a human being who needed help. The prince's eyes found Margaret in the crowd. Dr. Margaret Thornfield saved my life using methods that were completely different from anything the royal physicians had tried. Within hours of her treatment, my fever broke. Within days, I was well enough to leave my bed. Within a week, I was completely recovered. Dr. Pemberton could contain himself no longer. "Your Highness, with all due respect, The woman was practicing medicine illegally. She had no right to treat you without permission from the royal physicians. The prince turned to face Dr. Pemberton directly. Dr. Pemberton, let me ask you something. If you were drowning in a river, and someone threw you a rope, would you ask to see their credentials before grabbing it? Or would you be grateful to be saved? Dr. Pemberton's face reddened. That is not the same thing, Your Highness, is it not? The prince replied, I was drowning in illness, and Dr. Thornfield threw me a lifeline. Should I have refused her help because she was a woman? Should I have died to preserve tradition? Lady Catherine stepped forward. Your Highness, if I may speak. The prince nodded. Lady Catherine turned to address the tribunal panel. Gentlemen, I was the one who brought Dr. Thornfield to the palace. I make no apologies for this decision. I watched the prince suffering, getting weaker each day, and I could not stand by and do nothing when I knew there was someone who might be able to help. She paused, looking around the hall. I have served the royal family for 15 years. I have never once questioned the established ways of doing things, but sometimes, when life is at stake, we must have the courage to try something new. The chief judge looked uncomfortable. Lady Catherine, while we appreciate your dedication to the prince's welfare, the fact remains that proper protocols were not followed. Margaret stood up. May I ask what these protocols accomplished? The prince was dying under your protocols. He lived when they were set aside. Which outcome better serves the royal family? One of the senior physicians on the panel leaned forward. Dr. Thornfield, you speak of your methods as though they are superior to established medical practice. But how do we know they are not simply luck? Margaret opened her medical bag and pulled out a thick notebook. This contains the records of every patient I have treated with symptoms similar to the prince's. 47 cases in total, 46 recoveries. That is not luck, gentlemen. That is systematic observation and effective treatment. She began to read from her notes, describing case after case of successful treatment. Workers from the factories, children from the streets, mothers struggling to feed their families, or had recovered using the same methods she had used on the prince. As she spoke, Margaret noticed something changing in the room. The audience was listening intently, and even some of the physicians on the panel seemed genuinely interested in her results. Her methods were not just different, they were measurably better. Dr. Thornfield, one of the younger physicians, asked, could you explain your theory about cleanliness and disease prevention? Margaret smiled. This was the first time anyone from the medical establishment had asked about her work instead of simply condemning it. I believe that many diseases are caused by tiny organisms that spread from person to person through contact with contaminated surfaces. By cleaning everything thoroughly and maintaining proper sanitation, we can prevent the spread of these organisms. An older physician shook his head. That is pure speculation. There is no evidence for such creatures. Margaret nodded. You are right that we cannot see them with our eyes alone. But I have observed that patients who are kept in clean conditions recover faster than those who are not. The evidence may not be visible, but the results speak for themselves. Prince Albert Victor stepped forward again. Gentlemen, I am not a doctor, but I am living proof that Dr. Thornfield's methods work. Is that not evidence enough? The discussion continued for another hour, with physicians debating the merits of Margaret's approaches versus traditional methods. But Margaret could sense that something fundamental was shifting. The prince's testimony had changed the entire nature of the proceedings. Finally, the chief judge called for order. Dr. Thornfield, this tribunal was convened to address your unauthorized treatment of the prince. Given the unique circumstances, we need time to consider our decision. But before the panel could adjourn, the doors of the hall opened once more. This time, a royal messenger entered, carrying an official document with the royal seal. He approached the tribunal panel and handed the document to the chief judge. The judge read the document, his eyes widening with each line. He looked up at the assembled crowd, clearly struggling to process what he had just read. This is This is a royal proclamation, he announced. From Her Majesty Queen Victoria herself. The hall fell completely silent. The chief judge cleared his throat and began to read. By royal decree, Dr. Margaret Thornfield is hereby appointed as Royal Physician Extraordinaire, in recognition of her exceptional skill and dedication in saving the life of Prince Albert Victor. Dr. Thornfield shall have the authority to establish new protocols for royal medical care and to train other physicians in advanced medical techniques. The proclamation continued. Furthermore, it is hereby declared that medical skill and knowledge shall be the only requirements for royal medical service, regardless of the practitioner's gender or social background. The hall erupted in chaos. Some people cheered, others looked shocked, and a few of the older physicians appeared outraged. Margaret felt as though she were in a dream. Queen Victoria herself had not only pardoned her actions, but had given her an official position. Prince Albert Victor approached Margaret with a smile. "Dr. Thornfield, I promised you that when I was well, I would remember what you taught me about healing. I have kept that promise." Margaret felt tears in her eyes. "Your Highness, I am overwhelmed. I never expected." "You saved my life," the prince interrupted. "This is the least I can do to repay that debt." Lady Catherine joined them, her face glowing with pride. "Doctor, you have done more than save one life. You have opened a door that can never be closed." Over the following months, Margaret's appointment transformed the medical world. She established new standards for cleanliness and sanitation that dramatically reduced infections. She trained other women doctors, proving that gender was irrelevant to medical skill. Most importantly, she showed that the best medical care should be available to everyone, regardless of their social status. The changes were not without resistance. Some physicians left the royal service rather than work under a woman's supervision. Conservative newspapers criticized the Queen's decision, but the results spoke for themselves. Patient outcomes improved dramatically under Margaret's protocols. Margaret also used her position to bridge the gap between the medical care available to the rich and the poor. She established a program where royal physicians would regularly visit clinics in working-class neighborhoods, bringing advanced medical knowledge to those who needed it most. Years later, as Dr. Margaret Thornfield made her rounds through the royal quarters, she often reflected on that night when she had first entered the palace. She had risked everything to save one life, never imagining that it would lead to saving thousands of others. She thought about all the young women who were now able to study medicine openly, without deception or disguise. She thought about the patients who lived because of improved sanitation and better understanding of disease. She thought about the barriers that had seemed impossible to break but had fallen when confronted with simple human compassion. Margaret had learned that the most powerful force in the world was not royal blood or social position or traditional authority. It was the willingness to help another human being, regardless of who they were or where they came from. In the end, that was what medical